Welcome to Plain Civics. Thank you for joining us. I'm Joe Ulery.
And I'm Bobbi Fisher.
And our goal is to break down how government works so you can make the government work for you. And today we are to episode 21.
Wow.
Today we're going to be talking about the First Amendment. But before we get to that, it is time for the Fast Five.
The Fast Five.
Today I'm asking you, what's one lesson you learned in life that stuck?
That was a hard one. I came up with two. I learned self-reliance and also never stop learning.
Keep your brain active.
Right.
Number two, what's something people are always surprised to learn about you?
That I'm an introvert. Even my doctor's like, how can you be a teacher and be an introvert? Well, it's a different, there you're like on a stage.
Yes.
But otherwise, I like quiet and I don't mind being by myself and I don't like going to parties and being around a lot of people I don't know, and that's just me.
And in a classroom, you're comfortable with the topic.
Right.
And you're the expert.
Right.
Yeah. Number three, do you collect anything?
Oh, I laughed when I saw this. I wrote down dust with 3 exclamation marks.
I've been collecting dust for years.
Oh, well, it's a good thing my parents aren't alive because they would come and run their fingers along the... But as a kid, I had a big stamp collection. It's out in my garage somewhere, but I would say books. I have tons of books. People hate it when I move. I've even the last few years have taken a lot of them to half-price books, but I still have a lot of books.
Number four, what qualities do you most value in others?
Honesty, loyalty, and forgiveness.
Wow. Forgiveness, that's a great one. Number five, what's the most valuable feedback you've ever received?
The most memorable one is when I was doing my student teaching back in 1980. My supervising teacher, a couple of the classes I taught were world history. It was high school. And he asked me one day when we were on break, I got to tell you something. He said, have you ever been to Italy? And I'm like, what? And he's like, Italy. He says, you pronounce Italian, Italian. And he's like, it's Italian.
Wow.
And I was like, okay. And I'm
Never said it.
Make it a point to never say Italian anymore.
That's so
But it
funny.
made a lot of sense. But I think it was just a Hoosier thing. I think that's the way
We do that.
Yeah, so it's Italian.
Italian, yeah. So the word that I got corrected on once, and it will never happen again, is anyways. People always say anyways, and somebody's like, it's anyway. So I never made that mistake twice.
It makes you hyper vigilant about it, does.
Especially when you speak for a living. So, all right, fun. Thank you for the Fast Five this week. And we are ready to jump into our topic, which is more relevant, I think, today than it has been in a very long time. So let's get to work, Bobbi.
And now our feature presentation.
I titled this one, I actually did a couple titles and kept changing it. Is freedom of expression the most important part of the First Amendment, part 1? Because this one is going to be 2 parts because it's big. So I thought we'll start out just as a refresher. I know I did this a while back in an episode, but I'm going to read the text of the First Amendment as it's written. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, or the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. So the First Amendment includes a lot of freedoms, 5 to be exact if you were keeping count. There's no way we could cover all 5 of those freedoms in one 40 or so minute podcast. And each of the freedoms is too important to not be covered thoroughly. In this episode, we're going to look at why the framers made this the First Amendment, why they put these 5 freedoms in here, instead of including them separately, for example, in like 5 separate amendments. Why are they all together? And then also, even though freedom of religion is mentioned first in the First Amendment, we're going to skip that for now.
Okay.
And we will only be talking in the next 2 episodes about what comes under the umbrella freedom of expression, which includes the other 4 freedoms that were mentioned in shortened form: speech, press, assembly, and petition. We're going to cover freedom of expression first because Parts of expression have been front and center in the news recently. We did talk a little bit about freedom of speech in our Say What episode, which was episode 16. We discussed common misconceptions about what is meant by freedom of speech, but in this episode we will look at where the idea of freedom of speech comes from and how it has been in the news recently. I will start this episode with insight from a scholarly book, which is entitled The Bill of Rights, A History and Documents by John J. Patrick. Dr. Patrick, who I met several times, was a professor of education at Indiana University for many years and an expert in civics education, as well as an expert in teaching and promoting democracy in several post-communist countries of Central and Eastern Europe. The opening paragraph in his book begins like this, and this is quoted. From their founding era until today, Americans have believed that the highest purpose of government is protection of the rights of the people to whom it is accountable. Commitment to ideals about rights to liberty and equality is the foundation of an American national identity. These ideals are the core by which unity is sustained among the extraordinarily diverse people of the United States of America. End of quote. As we pointed out in earlier episodes, the first government of the United States under the Articles of Confederation, our first Constitution, was so weak and ineffective that the rights of the people were at risk. The government was too weak to protect threats to the rights of life, liberty, and property. As a response to this, the men called to Philadelphia in the summer of 1787 to revise the Articles of Confederation decided that it was not worth saving because it was too weak. They decided it would be better to start from scratch, and they created a new constitution and form of government that they thought would be strong enough to guarantee the rights of the people, but not so strong that it would violate those rights. The new and improved U.S. Constitution was ratified in 1788 and took effect in 1789. And then in 1791, the new nation ratified what we now refer to as the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. It specifies the rights that the government is supposed to protect and not abuse. The U.S. Constitution and Bill of Rights and all of the amendments are often referred to as living documents. This is due to the fact that America is a nation based on an idea expressed in the Declaration of Independence that all people are endowed, quote, with certain unalienable rights, end quote, and that the purpose of government is, quote, to secure these rights, end quote. Rights are at the very center of Americans' national identity and why so many people want to make America their home. Unfortunately, the Bill of Rights did not come with an instruction manual, and over time it's been the courts who have had to interpret what they think the framers meant by the words set forth in these documents, often having to look at history and prior interpretations. One thing is clear, though, and that it is up to we the people to make these rights continue to be enjoyed and not infringed upon by the government. One of America's greatest judges, Learned Hand, said, quote, "Liberty lies in the hearts of men and women. When it dies there, no constitution, no law, no court can save it," end quote. It is what we allow as far as policies and attitudes that will determine if these documents that guide us will be allowed to continue living in our daily lives. The story of our basic rights and the protection and possible abuse of them is a story longer than our nation's history. Think back to our earlier episodes when I told about the English people starting to demand more and more rights, beginning with the Magna Carta in 1215 and up to the 1689 English Bill of Rights. The American colonies also wrote various colonial charters and laws protecting the colonists' rights, some even more detailed than the English Bill of Rights. Remember, many of the colonists and their ancestors had fled their native lands of Europe due to violations of their rights. From 1776 to present day, Americans have been activated by and responded to public issues about constitutional rights. A study of voting rights, the slavery issue, civil rights issues, free speech, and so on show that Americans value these and other rights and will do whatever they can, including sometimes dying, to protect these rights. So why did Madison and the other framers put these 5 freedoms in the First Amendment? Many of the framers felt that these 5 rights are more important than all of the others because they are essential to democratic government. Without freedom of religion, members of an unpopular faith can be denied civil freedoms, as they had seen in England and in a couple of the colonies. We will look at religious freedom in a separate episode, but keep in mind that this is one of the rights the colonists had fought for. Without freedoms of speech, press, assembly, and petition, citizens cannot be fully informed about important issues or take action on them. The First Amendment starts with the words, "Congress shall make no law." Although at first this only applied to Congress, the Supreme Court eventually ruled that it also means federal, state, and local governments, not just Congress or the federal government. The amendment does not apply to private actions or speech. And I just put a note here. You can go back to episode 16 or Say What episode and get more details to remind you of why it doesn't apply to private actions. So freedom of speech, press, assembly, and petition are all considered under the umbrella of expression. So you often will hear reference to freedom of expression rather than freedom of speech, because many times more than one of these 4 rights may be intertwined in a cause. But let's look at speech first. What is considered speech? Is it just spoken words, or does it include actions too? Can there be limits placed on speech? Again, we look back at history for guidance. In the 16th century, King Henry VIII could send a man to prison for saying, "I like not the proceedings of this realm." I'll translate that into modern language. I don't like what's going on in the government of this country. In earlier time, the punishment for saying something like that would have been death for treason. England also had a very restrictive system of licensing for publications. None of England's early documents included freedom of speech or press. The first time freedom of speech was mentioned in America was in the 1641 Massachusetts Body of Liberties. After the Revolutionary War, several states included freedom of speech in their state constitutions. It's taken a couple of centuries to get us to the understanding that we have today for freedom of speech and expression. In fact, just 9 years into our nation's history, under the new Constitution and Bill of Rights, our own Congress passed what were known as the Alien and Sedition Acts of 1798. And just a side note there, I know as a former 8th grade history teacher and civics, the Alien and Sedition Acts are always usually mentioned at that point in time in a middle school history class, but not really to a large extent, just kind of a basic brush over it. So I'm going to give you a little more detail here. The Sedition Act is relevant to freedom of speech. Sedition means literally urging the resistance to lawful authority or rebellion against the government. The Sedition Act made it a crime to write, print, or say, quote, any false, scandalous, and malicious, end quote, statements against the government and its officials, or, quote, to incite against them the hatred of the good people of the United States, end quote. The act was the product of President John Adams and his Federalist allies in Congress, mainly to suppress dissent by their political opponents, which at the time were the Democratic Republicans, led by Thomas Jefferson. And I'm going to pause there for just a minute. I know we've mentioned briefly political parties from the past, and we will eventually do an episode on the evolution of political parties. But at the very beginning of our country, like under Washington, there weren't any political parties. He was elected unanimously, was not a party member, but in the course of the first couple of presidential terms, and it's understandable that factions, or what becomes political parties, are to develop. So the first two are the Federalists And as I've said before, the Democratic Republicans, which is very confusing, especially to eighth graders that only know Democrat and Republicans. So but those were the names of our first two political parties. One of the first persons convicted under the Sedition Act was a member of Congress who accused President Adams of, quote, an unbounded thirst for ridiculous pomp, foolish adulation, and selfish avarice, which means greed. And that's the end of the quote.
Just a quick reality check here. Is this still in effect?
No.
Okay. That answers the question.
We'll get to what happens here in just a second, but that's a good question. The Sedition Act was never challenged in the Supreme Court at the time, but it was hugely unpopular and contributed to the defeat of the Federalists and Adams Party in 1800, and it expired shortly thereafter. From 1800 to 1917, laws attempting to prohibit free speech were attempted in some states, especially when in regards to slavery. World War I began in 1914, but the U.S. didn't get involved until 1917. But as the U.S. involvement became more and more imminent, along with, as you would expect, the criticisms around getting involved in such a war, Congress passed what's known as the Espionage Act of 1917. The act made it illegal to interfere with the recruitment of soldiers and the draft, and to, quote, willfully utter, print, write, or publish any disloyal, profane, scurrilous, or abusive language about the form of government of the United States, end of quote. More than 2,000 people were convicted under the Espionage Act. The law was challenged repeatedly, and the Supreme Court finally had to hear cases on freedom of speech. The court upheld the law on several occasions, and it began developing a doctrine of free speech that would eventually protect the very speech forbidden by the Espionage Act. From World War I forward, the Supreme Court has been the primary player in defining free speech. One thing, and from here on out, I'm just going to refer, when I'm talking about the Supreme Court, as the court, so I don't have to keep repeating Supreme Court. So one thing the court has done and had done over that time is develop some principles for defining what speech includes. Then they have pure speech, which involves spoken words, such as in a debate or a public meeting. They've decided that pure speech has the greatest protection under the First Amendment. And then they have developed what is called speech plus, which is speech combined with action, such as picketing and demonstrations. The speech part here is generally protected, but the action part may be regulated. Symbolic speech is conduct that conveys a message in itself without spoken words and is sometimes known as expressive conduct. Some forms of symbolic speech are protected while others are not. For example, in the case United States v. O'Brien from 1968, in which O'Brien's claim was that burning his draft card in protest of the war in Vietnam was symbolic speech. The court ruled against O'Brien, saying that draft cards were necessary for the legitimate government purpose of raising an army, and the federal law prohibiting the destruction of draft cards was not designed to suppress dissent. In Texas v. Johnson in 1989, a key case regarding flag burning as symbolic speech, the court ruled in favor of Johnson. Johnson had burned an American flag at the 1984 Republican Convention and was convicted under a Texas law that made it a crime to, quote, desecrate a flag. The court ruled that, quote, if there is a bedrock principle underlying the First Amendment, it is that the government may not prohibit the expression of an idea simply because society finds the idea itself offensive or disagreeable, end quote. Soon after this case, Congress passed the Flag Protection Act of 1989, which punished flag desecration whether or not it offended onlookers. Protesters burned flags on the steps of the U.S. Capitol after it passed and challenged the law in court. In United States v. Eichmann, 1990, the court held that the Flag Protection Act was unconstitutional. Again, the court held that the government could not prohibit the expression of an idea simply because society found the idea offensive, and that protecting the flag did not outweigh the First Amendment's protection of expressive conduct. And to bring this into now, on August 25th, 2025, President Donald Trump signed Executive Order Number 14341, called Prosecuting Burning of the American Flag, ordering, quote, the enforcement to the fullest extent possible of our nation's criminal and civil laws against acts of American flag desecration, end quote. The text of the order acknowledges the findings of Texas v. Johnson, but omits acknowledgement of United States v. Eichmann. Many experts believe this executive order could backfire and actually encourage protesters to burn flags to protest it and challenge Trump's executive order. Now, nothing that I know of has happened yet, but it seems like this executive order has already been ruled upon. One of the basic principles of free speech is the concept of a public forum, or a place such as a street or a park that is commonly used for freedom of speech and other First Amendment rights, such as petition. Government cannot deny free speech rights in a public forum, but may issue what are called, quote, time, place, and manner regulations about where, when, and how it may be exercised. The government cannot, however, make regulations on content or the nature of the message. The court has also ruled on what is known as overbreadth and vagueness. Overbreadth means that a law restricts protected speech as well as unprotected speech and is not written narrowly to serve the government's legitimate purposes. Vagueness means the law is not clear and specific, so that reasonable people are not able to understand what kind of expression is forbidden. The court has also said that the government cannot force a person to be silent, nor can it force a person to speak. The government, while it must be content neutral about citizens' speech, is not forbidden from communicating its own messages and making value choices. For example, if the government is supplying funding for a program, it is entitled to define the limits of that program. This comes from the case Rust v. Sullivan, 1991, where government regulations prevented family planning clinics that receive federal funds from giving their clients information about abortion. Lastly, in politics, prior to the highly controversial case Citizens United v. FEC from 2010, the court had upheld laws that restricted direct contributions to a candidate since large contributions could imply corruption. But in the highly controversial Citizens United case, the court struck down corporate and union spending limits in a very close 5-4 decision. The court held that the First Amendment protects corporations and unions from restrictions on independent political spending, such as in, quote, electioneering communications, end quote. The majority reasoned that the government cannot suppress political speech based on the identity of the speaker, whether a corporation, union, or individual. You know, for people, I think we've mentioned the Citizens United case a couple times before. This is what has allowed our politics in the last 20 years, or not quite 20 years yet. We have all these big dollars,
right.
These people, for example, like Musk, who put in tons and tons of money to one candidate. So if you have somebody, you know, you're running for an office and you have someone who's extremely wealthy,
Right.
it seems unfair, and it's not the way it was prior to 2010. The contributions were limited, which seemed to make elections more fair,
Right.
I guess is what I'm trying to say. So this is still a highly controversial case over the spending. Okay, so back to this. Finally, let's look at some limits on free speech. As I have pointed out, especially in our Say What episode, our rights are not absolute. There can be certain restrictions or limitations. For example, obscene speech is not protected by the First Amendment. Obscenity is generally defined as anything that depicts sex or nudity in a way that violates society's standards of decency. In the case Miller v. California from 1973, this case is important because it established a 3-part test for obscenity. Under the Miller test, which the court still uses today for obscenity cases, a work is considered legally obscene if it meets all 3 of the following criteria. Number 1, an average person applying contemporary community standards would find that the work, taken as a whole, appears to the prurient, or which means lustful, interest. 2, the work depicts or describes sexual conduct in a patently offensive way. as specifically defined by applicable state law. And 3, the work, taken as a whole, lacks serious literary, artistic, political, or scientific value, which is sometimes referred to as the SLAPS test for serious literary, artistic, political, and scientific. The First Amendment does not protect defamation or damaging another person's reputation through false information. Slander is defamation through the spoken word, and libel is defamation through the written word. And I always used to tell students, you can remember it if you think spoken starts with S, so slander is spoken, libel is written. The court has developed very strict standards for slander and libel of public officials and public figures because defamation lawsuits can create a chilling effect on free speech. We will discuss these standards in greater detail in the next episode when we get to freedom of the press. The First Amendment also does not protect abusive or insulting language known as fighting words. In the case Chaplinsky v. New Hampshire from 1942, the court held that such words, spoken face-to-face, quote, have a direct tendency to cause acts of violence, end quote, and are not protected speech. This is where hate speech falls as well. Hate speech is any form of communication that attacks, uses derogatory, or discriminatory language or incites hatred, discrimination, or violence against a person or a group based on their identity. This can include spoken or written words as well as images, gestures, and symbols. In fact, the Supreme Court unanimously reaffirmed that there is no hate speech exception to the First Amendment.
Just the fact that the court unanimously ruled on anything, you got my attention there.
That's amazing, right?
Yes.
Advertising or commercial speech is not fully protected by the First Amendment. The government can regulate false advertising, but it cannot regulate false ideas. It can also prohibit the advertisement of illegal products or services. And in 1986, the court held that the government may restrict advertisements for legal products if it has the power to outlaw them altogether. The examples there are alcohol and tobacco products.
I remember looking at magazines or seeing TV commercials.
Right.
Smoking.
Yeah.
Don't see that now.
Nope. Speech may be restricted in some places, even though it could not be in others. The court has upheld restrictions on freedom of speech in military bases, prisons, and schools when the expression interferes with the purpose of the facility. For example, in 1976, the court ruled that military authorities can prohibit political literature on military bases, and this is still true in 2025. There have been several high-profile Supreme Court cases involving free speech in public schools. Probably one of the most famous is Tinker v. Des Moines School District from 1969. The court established that teachers and students do not, quote, shed their constitutional rights of freedom of speech or expression at the schoolhouse gate. It's a very famous quote from this case. The Tinker children, it was a brother and a sister, were suspended for wearing black armbands to protest the Vietnam War. The court ruled in the Tinkers' favor and recognized their right to use symbolic speech as long as it would not, quote, materially and substantially disrupt, end quote, the school's educational purpose. The court also upheld the broad power of school officials to censor, quote, school-sponsored expressive activities, end quote, such as student newspapers and plays. This was determined in the case Hazelwood School District v. Kohlmeyer in 1988. Supreme Court established the clear and present danger test in 1919 to decide if government can punish speech when it creates an immediate threat of criminal action. In 1969, the court heard the Brandenburg v. Ohio case and revised the test to be known as the imminent lawless action test. This modern test states that speech can only be restricted if it is directed at inciting or producing imminent lawless action and is likely to incite or produce such action. Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes argued that the First Amendment should promote, quote, free trade in ideas, that the best test of truth is the power of the thought to get itself accepted in the competition of the market, end quote. According to this theory, government should allow speech that promotes offensive ideas because suppressing speech would be even more damaging to society. Justice Holmes also said, quote, "Free thought for those who agree with us, but freedom for the thought that we hate." End of quote. Under this marketplace of ideas model of free speech, the best way to respond to offensive speech is with more speech or counter speech. Freedom of speech protects the Oath Keepers and Proud Boys demonstrations, but it also protects No Kings and NAACP marches and demonstrations. This is the price we pay for liberty. So whether you agree with the first two there or the last ones, it doesn't matter. They all have the right. In this episode, I've tried to explain some of the ideas behind freedom of speech, definitions, and protections. In the next episode, I will cover the remaining parts of freedom of expression. That includes freedom of press, assembly, and petition. And we'll look at more current examples of those freedoms in that episode, such as the recent suspension of late-night host Jimmy Kimmel.
Very good. All right. So we're going to continue this thought into the next episode. Right now, though, it's time for the pop quiz. Bueller.
Last episode's question is, we elect a U.S. representative for how many years? So what's their term of office?
Right.
If you answered 2 years, you get the prize. That is correct.
And if you said they are in constant election mode, you get a bonus.
That is true. So I would also challenge each listener to name the House district that you live in and who your U.S. representative is. And I know we have 435 of those throughout the U.S., so I mentioned our Indiana senators with the last question that we had, but, it's going to vary much more. But you should know who your two senators are, what congressional district you live in by number, and who your representative is.
Wow, I'm going to have to look that up for me. And part that does change, though, from time to time, especially if there's an adjustment during the census.
Right. And if they decide in Indiana, for example, to change our maps, it may change again.
All right, so 2 years is the correct answer.
That's correct.
All right.
So this week's question, who does a U.S. Senator represent? So just give us a description of who their constituents are, a U.S. Senator.
Okay, so that wraps up the pop quiz for last episode and this episode, and now it's time for the Plain Civics Honor Roll.
This week, I would like to recognize Frank and Denise Schoensiegel as regular listeners to our podcast, and we thank them very much for their support and listening.
And as we always say, if you'd like to be considered for the Plain Civics Honor Roll, say something to us, post something on our Facebook page, send us a message, review our podcast. There are lots of different ways that you can put your name into consideration for the Plain Civics Honor Roll. So again, congratulations to Frank and Denise for induction this week. And that's it for this episode of Plain Civics, breaking down the basics, no politics, just facts. Thanks for listening, and until next time, stay informed and stay engaged. This is Plain Civics. Join us for the journey as we break down the basics of how government works, so you can make the government work for you.